Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This is Rabbi Stephen Epstein here, Rob Shmuel, my handle Roshby. So, hope you're doing well. We're coming up into what I like to kind of call a high holidays, a spring high holidays, because we have Passover coming up, right? And that's a week, give or take, week, 8 days, depending on where you're at. And second day, of course, we start counting the Omer. Omer is a unit of measure. It's how much barley was delivered to the temple, and it also commemorates the beginning of the spring harvest, the early barley harvest. And then that leads up to Shavuot, which is, Shavuot is the plural for 7 weeks. And that, of course, is when Moses went up to the Mount Sinai, received the Ten Commandments, and came down. And it really kind of marked the beginning of this religion that we now call Judaism. So it is kind of, to me, sort of a high holidays. It's very, very noticeable. And one of the things that you notice with a lot of Jewish holidays is that they revolve around food, either formally, like Passover, where you have to restrict your diet, or to a certain extent, or Yom Kippur, where you're really restricting your diet to nothing, right? Or is sometimes it's just kind of tradition, like we eat dairy on Shavuot. There's nothing really that mandates that. It's just kind of a tradition based on some of the holiday. We'll talk about that as we get closer to Shavuot. So, looking forward to it. Of course, this year Pesach coincides with Shabbat. We'll have our two services Saturday morning, which will be the Pesach 1, and then Sunday morning, which will be Pesach 2. Please note, we are starting 9:30. It's going to be a longer service, and this way we won't be here till the afternoon until we do Havdalah. So I thought you could get up a little earlier for a couple of days. Why not, right? Anyway, so let's shift over to this week's Torah portion, which is Metzora. And last week we discussed Tazria, now we have Metzora. And during years which are not leap years, when we don't have the extra month, these two portions are typically read together because they have a very similar theme, and it's the impurity of blemishes. So we had in Tazria, we talked about first the impurity of a woman that just gives birth. She's got her basically an open wound. I mean, think about it. So she needs to purify herself or clean herself, in order to prevent infections. And also, there's a spiritual component to that as well, of course. And it's interesting how the spiritual and the hygienic components tend to mesh. This is the thing about Judaism, folks, is that, it's all encompassing. It involves your entire life and lifestyle. So it is with this particular portion, Metzora, because then, after that, we saw the idea of skin blemishes, what happens when you get blemishes on your, or something happens, you get streaks on your clothes. In Metzora, we have streaks on the walls. There are a couple of ideologies to this, as there usually is in Judaism, and some different opinions. But basically, what happens if you go to your house and you look on the walls and all of a sudden there's a red or a green streak on it? Well, of course you do. What you typically do is you call in the priest. Priest takes a look at it. If it's surface, they just scrape it off and see what happens. If it's embedded, if it's deep, that means there's a deeper issue. So remember, when these things get deeper into the skin or the building or the clothes, that is probably more indicative of a deeper issue, a deeper level problem. So, whereas the blemishes on the skins were indications that somebody is gossiping or talking bad about people, and it's a way that they get outed. And we talked about the idea that people have feelings, and people tend to show their feelings. Unless you're very stoic, unless you're a sociopath, or unless you're a very good actor, most of us tend to what a person's thinking because of the way they look, the way they behave, the way they comport themselves, the expressions on their face. Okay, here it's a little different, or maybe it's not. Here, it's the building is really showing you what's going on. So the building is transparent as well. And a lot of people say that the reason these things happen on the building, on your walls and stuff, is because this is somebody who's pretty much selfish. So they might say, "Oh no, instead of giving an ox or a bull, I can only afford a pigeon or a turtle dove." Next thing you know, their house comes down with these streaks. You pull it up. They start pulling the bricks apart, to isolate the bricks that are in quote unquote infected, and you discover hordes of cash that they're hiding. Because they don't want anybody to know that they're rich, that people will come and demand more of them in the upkeep of the temple or in the upkeep of charity. So it's a way that the house is outed. The final portion of Metzora is really kind of interesting, and this is what falls within our triennial cycle, our triennial reading for 5782. And it talks about the physical hygienic consequences of either a man and a woman being intimate or secretions that happen, in the sexual organs. And they say that, and it's a little bit kind of doubtful what really is going on, because sometimes the Torah can be vague. Is this just when two people are physically intimate, or is it an unusual occurrence, or is it both? And the idea is that, this is how life continues, by a man and a woman being physically intimate, by having sex. So when that happens, when you have that exchange of body fluids, it can be a have potentially serious consequences if one of the partners may not be up to, optimum health. Now, back in the day, they didn't really worry about things like, heart disease or pulmonary disease, because people, they were working every day. They were working out all the time. So, my high school friend Karen, if you're listening, has a sister that was writing for a newspaper in Australia, and she was doing a column 3 times a week or so. Susan was, and she had one column that I thought was real fascinating. She talked about the '50s wife, that wore the house dress, that had this, perfect little figure, because the housewife in the '50s didn't have the modern conveniences we had. So they were always working, and therefore they were always moving, and therefore they were always working out, vacuuming, ironing, cooking food the old fashioned way without modern conveniences. We just put it in a microwave or whatever. So basically, back then, men were out there in the fields working all day. They were either farming or they were herding cattle. They were out there walking around with the animals. When the women were making food, they were picking up and lifting their babies, to make sure that they were clean and stuff. So they were moving a lot. So they didn't really have a lot of the disease that we have today from inactivity, because they were always active. Nevertheless, they didn't have the modern medicine that we have, so they could be possibly susceptible to various bacteria and whatever. So it was very important, almost critical, that hygienic measures were followed. Hence the mayim chayim, the living water, the running water, the mikvah. You didn't just get into a bath that, had sitting water that just sat there. You had the water that was flowing. So any dirt or anything that came off your body, the water came in and then it was drained. See, so so you didn't infect people. And they also had periods of time when you were ultimately in quarantine, when you had to go outside the camp, outside the camp, right? So they had all these practices that kind of compensated for the lack of medical technology. Also, if a man or a woman had an unusual discharge coming from maybe the groin area or something, that was something that they would, carefully evaluate. Is it maybe just a fluke? Because our bodies do things every now and then. When it happens more often, that's the problem. So that's something that very concerned. Now, isn't it interesting? And I always like to point this out, how the Torah focuses on certain things. And we have this idea of skin blotches, discharges, etc. we've got two portions on that. So obviously, this was something to keep the Israelites healthy and clean and alive and working optimally. Now, as I'm talking, I'm realizing I said there was a couple of different opinions about the houses. Let me go back to that real quick. Um, that's the majority opinion. Some people say that the reason the houses got streaks is because when the Israelites conquered the promised land, the people that were there that they basically, dispossessed of their land used to hide stuff there, and that was one way of finding it. So, one way is kind of a pessimistic way of looking at it, another way is an optimistic. Take your pick. Again, in Judaism, there's always a couple of different ways to look at something. Okay, folks, Shabbat Shalom. I want to thank all of you that have paid attention to my 10-minute Torah all these years. It's been about a little over a year and a half. I've been at Temple Shalom, and I've been doing this for about, 5, 6 years. Thank you, Sherry. May she rest in peace, Sherry Reader. She got me started on this. We are kind of at the beginning of a year, of the secular year, the month of Nisan. When we left Egypt is the beginning of our secular year. So in a sense, Happy New Year to you folks as we celebrate the new month of Nisan and the new year. And looking forward to seeing you all at services.